The cashier's hand hovered over the scanner, waiting with a polite but growing impatience, while the red letters on the card reader mocked me with a single word: declined. I felt a hot, prickly heat crawl up my neck, staining my cheeks a deep crimson as the line of people behind me began to shift and mutter. I tried the card again, my fingers trembling so hard I nearly dropped it, but the result was the same. My husband Mark was sitting in the car just 10 feet away through the glass storefront, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone, knowing perfectly well that he had drained the joint account an hour before I left the house. He didn't just cut me off, he chose to do it on the very afternoon his sister, Sarah, arrived on our doorstep with 4 suitcases and 3 screaming children, announcing that they would be living with us indefinitely. As I stood there, clutching a bag of groceries I could no longer pay for, I realized that the man I had spent 5 years building a life with had just turned me into a stranger in my own home. It wasn't always a battlefield of cold glances and empty bank accounts. Just 2 years ago, our life together felt like a sanctuary, a soft place to land after a long day. I remember the way the morning light used to hit the kitchen table, turning the steam from our coffee mugs into swirling gold ribbons. Mark would lean over, kiss the top of my head, and tell me that as long as we had this house and each other, nothing else mattered. We had bought the Victorian fixer-upper on the edge of town with my inheritance from my grandmother, a beautiful, crumbling lady of a house that we spent 18 months restoring with our own hands. I remember the smell of sawdust and floor wax, the shared laughter when we accidentally painted the guest room the wrong shade of blue, and the way he held me on the bare floorboards of the living room the night we finally moved in. "You're my rock, Elena," he would whisper into my hair. "I don't know where I'd be without you." At the time, I was working as a senior project manager for a boutique architectural firm. I loved the rhythm of the work, the thrill of seeing a blueprint turn into a physical structure. But Mark began to chip away at my career with a slow, gentle persistence. He would complain about the long hours, the way I looked tired when I came home, or how he missed our long lunches. "Why are you killing yourself for a company that doesn't care about you?" he'd ask, his voice full of a simulated concern that I mistook for devotion. "I'm making enough now. My promotion at the firm is a lock. Why don't you take a break? Focus on the house. Focus on us. Maybe start that garden you always talked about." He made it sound like a gift, a chance to breathe. And like a fool, I took it. I resigned, thinking I was stepping into a new chapter of domestic bliss. For the first few months, it was exactly that. I planted the rose bushes, I refinished the antique vanity in the master bedroom, and I had dinner waiting on the table at 6 o'clock every night. I felt cherished, protected, and completely oblivious to the fact that I was slowly handing over every tether I had to the outside world. The first cracks in our gilded cage didn't come from Mark, but from his family. His mother, Evelyn, and his sister, Sarah, had always been difficult, a word Mark used to brush off their constant demands for money and attention. Evelyn was a woman who saw her son as a personal retirement fund, and Sarah was a professional victim who had never held a job for more than 3 months. "Sarah's just going through a rough patch," Mark would say, his hand shielding his phone as he sent another $500 to cover her utility bills. "She doesn't have anyone else, Elena. Family stays together." I tolerated it because I loved him, and because I thought our foundation was solid enough to withstand their occasional tremors. I didn't mind the Sunday dinners where Evelyn would criticize my cooking, or the way I decorated the house she hadn't contributed a cent toward. I would just smile, squeeze Mark's hand under the table, and wait for them to leave. I didn't realize that while I was busy making our house a home, they were busy measuring it for themselves. The atmosphere began to shift about 6 months ago. Mark's promotion never seemed to materialize, yet he was working later than ever. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a calculating sharpness. He started questioning every penny I spent, even though the money originally used to purchase our home and sustain us during my break had come from my own savings. "Is this artisanal bread really necessary, Elena?" he'd ask, holding up a loaf as if it were a piece of evidence in a crime. "We need to be more mindful. The economy is changing. I'm carrying the full weight of this household on my shoulders, you know." I felt a twinge of guilt, a sense of debt that he cultivated with masterly precision. I began to shrink. I stopped buying new clothes, I canceled my gym membership, and I started checking the prices of generic brands with a frantic intensity. I felt like I was auditioning for the role of his wife every single day, and I was failing the screen test. Then came the morning of the grocery store incident. Mark had been unusually quiet at breakfast, his eyes darting to his phone every few seconds. When the doorbell rang at 10 a.m., I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find Sarah standing there, flanked by 3 children and a mountain of luggage that looked like it belonged in a cargo plane. "Move over, Elle," Sarah said, pushing past me without so much as a hello. "Mark said the east bedrooms were empty. Kids, go pick your spots." I stood there, stunned, as her children raced up my stairs with muddy shoes, their screams echoing through the hallways I had spent months painting. I looked at Mark, who was walking down the stairs, a strange, defiant smirk on his face. "Mark, what is this?" I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Sarah needs a place to stay, Elena. Her ex kicked her out," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the tenderness that used to live there. "And since you're not bringing in an income, I decided we needed to consolidate. From today, things are changing. You want to live here? You pay for yourself. I'm done subsidizing your lifestyle while my own blood is struggling." He tossed his keys on the counter, the metal clattering against the marble I had paid for. "I've frozen the joint account. I'll handle the mortgage and the utilities. Anything else, your food, your gas, your personal crap, that's on you. Figure it out." He walked past me to help Sarah with her bags, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my own life. I was still in a daze when I went to the store an hour later, thinking I could at least buy enough food to get through the night. But as I stood before that blinking red "declined" screen, the reality finally shattered over me like a sheet of ice. This wasn't a rough patch. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a siege. And as I looked through the window at Mark, who was laughing at something on his phone in the car, I realized he wasn't waiting for me to come out. He was waiting for me to break. I walked back to the car with my head held high, though my insides felt like they were being scraped out with a rusty spoon. Mark didn't even look up when I climbed into the passenger seat, empty-handed. He just put the car in gear and drove in a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of my lungs. When we pulled into the driveway of the house my grandmother had left me, the house I had poured my soul into, I saw that the invasion was already complete. Sarah's oldest boy was swinging from the low branch of my prize-winning Japanese maple, and a pile of trash bags sat leaking on the pristine porch. "I can't believe you did that," I said, my voice trembling as I stepped out of the car. "You left me standing there like a beggar." Mark didn't stop. He walked toward the front door, his back a cold, rigid wall. "I told you, Elena, the free ride is over. If you can't contribute, you can't complain about how I manage the money I earn. Sarah needs me. My mother needs me. You just want to sit in a pretty house and play decorator." Inside, the chaos was visceral. The smell of stale cigarette smoke, Sarah's signature scent, already clung to the curtains. Evelyn, my mother-in-law, was sitting in my favorite armchair, sipping tea from one of my grandmother's bone china cups. She didn't look up, but a thin, satisfied smile played on her lips. "Oh, Elena," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Mark told us you were having a bit of a difficult time adjusting to the new reality. It's for the best, dear. This house is far too large for just 2 people. It's high time it was filled with family." "This is my house, Evelyn," I said, my voice cracking. "Ours, Elena," Mark corrected, stepping into the room. "What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. Isn't that what we said? Only now, I'm the one keeping the lights on. So maybe you should go upstairs and help Sarah unpack the rest of her things, instead of standing there making a scene." The days that followed were a blur of escalating indignities. I became a ghost in my own home. Sarah took over the kitchen, leaving piles of greasy pans in the sink for me to find every morning. Her children treated the hallway like a racetrack, and Evelyn began reorganizing my closets, moving my clothes into the damp basement to make room for Sarah's overflow. But it was the whispering that truly chilled me. I would walk into a room, and Mark, Evelyn, and Sarah would suddenly fall silent, their eyes tracking me with a predatory stillness. I caught snippets of conversations, words like equity, transfer, and legal capacity. "She's clearly not stable, Mark," I heard Evelyn hiss one afternoon as I stood outside the cracked door of the study. "Look at her. She barely speaks. She's not taking care of the house. You have to protect the family asset before she does something reckless." "I'm working on it, Ma." Mark's voice was low, strained. "The lawyer said as long as I can prove I've been the sole provider for the last year, and with the papers she already signed for the refinancing." My blood turned to ice. What papers? I remembered a night 3 months ago. I had a migraine, the kind that made the world throb in agonizing flashes. Mark had come to me with a stack of documents, his voice soft and soothing. "Just some insurance updates for the house, honey. I don't want you to worry about it. Just sign here so I can get it out of the way." I had trusted him. I had signed where he pointed, barely able to open my eyes. I waited until the house was asleep, the rhythmic snoring of Sarah's kids and the low hum of the refrigerator the only sounds in the dark. My heart was thumping so loudly I was sure it would wake them. I crept into the study, the floorboards groaning under my feet like they were trying to warn me. Mark's desk was locked, but I knew him. I knew he kept the spare key inside a hollowed-out book on the third shelf. My fingers fumbled, slick with sweat, as I turned the key. The lock clicked, a sound like a gunshot in the silence. I began to dig. Past bills, past bank statements that showed he had been diverting his entire salary into a private account I didn't know existed for months. And then, at the bottom of a blue folder, I found it. A quitclaim deed. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea and had to lean against the desk to keep from collapsing. There it was, my signature, shaky and crooked, exactly as it would have looked on the night of my migraine. The document transferred my entire interest in the property, my grandmother's house, to a family trust managed jointly by Mark and Evelyn. I wasn't just being sidelined, I was being erased. My vision narrowed until all I could see was that forged intent. My pulse was a frantic drumming in my ears, a deafening roar of betrayal. They hadn't just moved in, they had moved me out on paper before they ever stepped through the door. The rent he was demanding, the paying for myself, it was all a performance to build a case that I was a burden, a legal non-entity in my own home. I looked at the document in my trembling hands. This piece of paper was the weapon they were using to kill my life. I felt a coldness wash over me, starting from my fingertips and moving toward my heart. It wasn't the hot flash of anger I expected. It was a deep, freezing clarity. I realized in that moment that the man I loved didn't exist. He was a shell, a puppet for his mother's greed and his sister's laziness. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood there in the dark, the moonlight casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor, and I felt the last shred of my devotion to Mark snap like a dry twig. I took a photo of the document with my phone, my hands suddenly steady, and then I tucked it back exactly where I had found it. I locked the desk, replaced the key, and walked back to the bedroom we once shared. Mark was fast asleep, his breathing deep and even, the sleep of a man who thought he had already won. I lay on the very edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. I wasn't the broken wife anymore. I was a woman who had just seen the map of the war, and for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly where to strike. The next morning, the sun crawled over the horizon with a sickly, pale light that did nothing to warm the kitchen. I stood by the counter, my hand trembling as I gripped a cold mug of coffee, watching Sarah's children smear jam onto the antique mahogany table, a piece my grandmother had polished every Sunday for 40 years. Evelyn sailed into the room, her silk robe billowing like a battle flag. She didn't look at me, she went straight to the stove. "Mark says you were up late prowling the house, Elena. Honestly, your nerves are getting the better of you. I've made an appointment for you with Dr. Holloway for this afternoon. Just a little checkup to help with your episodes. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. Episodes? I haven't had any episodes, Evelyn, and I don't need an appointment with your brother's old golf partner. Mark stepped into the kitchen then, looking everywhere but at me. He looked smaller than he had the day before, his shoulders hunched as he reached for the coffee pot. "It's just for a consultation, Elle," he said, his voice a low, vibrating drone of cowardice. "You've been acting erratic, screaming about the bank account in public, obsessing over documents you don't understand. We're just worried." "Obsessing over documents?" I echoed, my voice sounding hollow and strange to my own ears. "You mean the quitclaim deed you tricked me into signing while I was drugged with a migraine? The one that gives your mother half the equity in the house my family paid for?" The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Sarah stopped chewing her toast, her eyes darting between Mark and Evelyn like she was watching a tennis match. Mark's face went a dusty gray. He finally looked at me, but there was no remorse in his eyes, only the panicked anger of a cornered animal. "I didn't trick you," he spat, slamming his mug onto the counter. "I protected us. You were going to run this place into the ground with your projects, and your refusal to see that we were drowning. I did what a man has to do to secure his family's future." "Your family?" I stepped toward him, my pulse thundering in my ears like a war drum. "I was your family, Mark. This house was our future, but you didn't want a future with me. You wanted a windfall for your mother and a free ride for your sister." Evelyn let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, listen to her. The grand lady of the manor. Elena, dear, let's be realistic. You haven't worked in a year. You have no assets. You're a guest here now, by the grace of my son's hard work. And if you continue to be difficult, well, Dr. Holloway has very strong opinions about women who can't handle the stresses of domestic life." The threat was naked and ugly. They weren't just stealing my house, they were setting the stage to have me declared mentally incompetent. If they could prove I was unstable, the deed would be the least of my worries. They could control every aspect of my life. "Is that the plan, Mark?" I asked, turning to him. My hands were ice cold, but my head was suddenly terrifyingly clear. "You're going to let them lock me away so you can sell this place and split the cash with your mother? Is that what 5 years of marriage is worth to you?" Mark looked down at his shoes, his jaw working. "It's not like that. We need the liquid capital. Sarah needs a fresh start, and Ma deserves a place that isn't a rental. You're being selfish, Elena. You always were." "Selfish?" I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, a sharp, jagged sound. "I paid for your car. I paid for your master's degree. I paid for the very floor you're standing on, and you think I'm the selfish one?" "Don't you dare speak to him like that." Sarah jumped in, her face flushed with a petty, newfound power. "You're just bitter because you're a failure. You couldn't even keep your job, and now you can't even keep your husband's loyalty. Mark told us everything, how you spend all day doing nothing while he slaves away. I spent all day restoring this house so you could have a place to ruin with your cigarettes and your entitlement," I snapped back. Suddenly, the front doorbell rang, a cheerful, melodic chime that felt like a mockery. "Ah," Evelyn said, smoothing her robe with a smug grin. "That would be Mr. Henderson. He's a real estate agent. He's here to do the initial walkthrough and appraisal." My world shattered for the second time in 24 hours. "Appraisal? You've already listed it." "We have an offer, Elena," Mark whispered, finally meeting my gaze with a look of cold, dead indifference. "A private sale. No inspections, cash closing in 10 days. We're moving to the city. Ma, Sarah, the kids, and me. There's a nice apartment we've looked at for you. It's a quiet place. Professional staff. You'll be much better off there." A quiet place. An assisted living facility. They had sold my life out from under me and were planning to park me in a ward while they spent my inheritance. The room began to spin. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to grab the edge of the table. I looked at Mark, really looked at him, and saw the stranger he had always been. The kindness had been a mask, the devotion a long con. He wasn't paralyzed by his mother, he was her willing lieutenant. "You have until the end of the week to pack your personal things," Evelyn said, her voice like a silken cord tightening around my neck. "And if there's any more talk about forged deeds or stolen money, I'll have the police here in 10 minutes to escort you to the clinic. Do I make myself clear?" I looked at the three of them, the mother, the son, the sister, standing in my kitchen, eating my food, plotting my ruin. My shock reached its peak, a white-hot point of agony that suddenly went cold. The Elena who loved Mark died in that kitchen, strangled by his silence and her greed. "Perfectly clear," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I turned and walked out of the room, listening to their resumed chatter and the clink of silverware against china. They thought I was going upstairs to cry. They thought I was going to pack a suitcase and wait for the men in white coats. But as I reached the landing, I didn't turn toward the bedroom. I went to the small, hidden wall safe behind the portrait in the hallway, the one Mark didn't know I had installed when we first moved in. Inside wasn't money or jewelry. Inside was a flash drive containing every original bank transfer from my grandmother's estate, the unedited footage from the security cameras I'd installed in the study months ago when I first got suspicious, and the contact card of a man I hadn't called in years. I sat on the floor in the dark hallway, listening to the real estate agent praise the crown molding I had stripped and stained by hand. I felt the click happen deep inside me. The tears were gone. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, calculating rage that felt more like home than this house ever had. They wanted a war. They wanted to treat me like a ghost. Fine. It was time I started haunting them. I didn't go to the clinic. Instead, I spent the next 3 days playing the part they had written for me. I moved like a ghost, eyes downcast, shoulders slumped, letting Evelyn's barbed comments slide off me like water off a stone. I watched them from the shadows of my own home as they paced out the rooms, already spending the money from a sale that hadn't happened yet. They were so blinded by their own greed that they didn't notice I was no longer crying. They didn't notice the way I kept my phone tucked into my pocket, recording every whispered conversation about the private buyer and the medication they planned to give me once I was moved to the facility. The transformation wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, freezing solidification of my will. On the 4th morning, I made one phone call. It was to David Sterling, my grandmother's old estate attorney, and a man who had known me since I was in diapers. "Elena," he said, his voice grave after I explained the situation and sent him the photos of the deed. "They didn't just commit fraud, they committed a federal crime involving a protected inheritance trust, and they made one fatal mistake. Your grandmother didn't leave you the house outright. She left it to you in a life estate with a bloodline clause. You couldn't have signed it away to a third-party trust even if you'd been wide awake and sober. The deed they forced you to sign isn't just unethical, it's legally paper-thin." A cold, sharp joy bloomed in my chest. "What do we do now, David?" "We wait for the signing," he whispered, "and then we close the trap." The day of the private sale arrived with a deceptive blue-sky beauty. Mark was wearing his best suit, looking like the successful man he pretended to be. Evelyn was practically vibrating with triumph, already clutching a brochure for a luxury condo in the city. Even Sarah had cleaned herself up, though the smell of cheap cigarettes still followed her like a shadow. They had gathered in the dining room, my dining room, with the real estate agent, a man named Mr. Henderson who looked far too slick for my liking. "Elena, dear," Evelyn said, her voice a sugary poison. "Why don't you sit in the corner? Mark has the papers ready. We just need to finalize the transfer of the trust assets." I sat. I waited. I watched Mark pick up the pen, his hand steady, his eyes cold. He looked at me one last time, a look of pity that made my skin crawl. "It's for the best, Elle. You'll see." Just as his pen touched the paper, the front door chimes rang. Not the melodic chime I was used to, but a heavy, rhythmic pounding. "Who on earth is that?" Evelyn hissed, her face tightening. I stood up, and for the first time in weeks, I let my spine go straight. I felt 3 inches taller. "That would be my guests, Evelyn." I opened the door to find David Sterling, 2 men in dark suits from the state's Financial Crimes Division, and a local police officer. The air in the dining room vanished instantly. Mark stood up, the pen dropping from his hand and leaving a dark ink stain on the white lace tablecloth. "What is this?" Mark stammered, his voice jumping an octave. "Elena, what have you done?" "I've invited the adults to the table, Mark," I said, walking to the head of the table. I looked at the real estate agent. "Mr. Henderson, I suggest you leave now if you want to keep your license. This property is under a life estate lien and is currently the subject of a criminal fraud investigation." The agent didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his briefcase and vanished through the front door before Evelyn could even find her breath. "You're delusional!" Evelyn shrieked, her face turning a mottled purple. "We have the deed! You signed it! Mark, tell them!" David Sterling stepped forward, laying a thick folder on the table. "The deed you obtained through coercion of a medicated individual, Evelyn? Or the deed that violated the 1994 bloodline trust established by Margaret Thorne? Not only is your family trust a legal fiction, but the attempt to transfer these assets constitutes felony grand larceny and elder abuse under the state's inheritance statutes." The next hour was a symphony of ruin. I sat and watched as the investigators played back the audio from my phone. Evelyn talking about drugging me to get the signature. Mark admitting he had been skimming from the joint account for months. The silence from Mark was no longer the silence of a husband ignoring his wife. It was the silence of a man watching the prison doors swing open. "I did it for us!" Mark suddenly screamed, turning on me, his face twisted in a mask of pathetic rage. "I was tired of living in your grandmother's shadow. I wanted something that was mine." "It was never yours, Mark," I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter stream. "And neither was I. You were just a guest in my life, and your reservation has just been canceled." The police didn't arrest them right then. That would come later, after the formal filings, but they served the immediate eviction and restraining orders David had prepared. I stood on the porch and watched as Sarah was forced to shove her children and her leaking trash bags back into her rusted minivan. I watched as Evelyn, stripped of her silk-robed dignity, huddled in the back of a taxi, shouting curses at me through the glass. And then there was Mark. He stood on the sidewalk, his expensive suit rumpled, looking at the house as if he couldn't understand how the locks had changed so fast. "Elena," he started, taking a step toward the porch. "Please, let's talk. My mother, she pushed me. You know how she is. I love you." "Mark," I said, leaning against the doorframe I had sanded with my own hands. "The only thing you love is an easy life. Go find one somewhere else. If you ever set foot on this property again, I won't call a lawyer. I'll call the sheriff." I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. The sound echoed through the hallway, a sharp, final clack that signaled the end of my life as a victim. 6 months have passed since that day. The house is quiet now, but it's a good kind of quiet. The smell of cigarette smoke is gone, replaced by the scent of fresh lavender and the lemon wax I use on the mahogany. I'm back at my firm, working on a new project, a community center for women who have lost everything. Every evening, I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the sun set behind the Japanese maple. The tree is healing. The branch Sarah's son broke has been grafted and tended, and new leaves are beginning to sprout. Mark is currently embroiled in a massive lawsuit for the return of my diverted funds, and his mother's retirement is now a small, dreary apartment paid for by the state. Sometimes, I look at the spot on the dining room table where the ink stain used to be. I worked for hours to remove it, scrubbing until the wood glowed again. It reminded me that even the deepest stains can be cleaned if you're willing to put in the work. I thought I needed Mark to be whole. I thought his family was my family. But as I look out over my garden, I realize that the most beautiful things grow best when you finally pull up the weeds. Betrayal is a fire that either consumes you or forges you into something unbreakable. I chose the fire, and now, for the first time in my life, I am finally home.